had a big defeat in 2015.
Yeah.
You then lost the Brexit referendum in 2016.
You really want to go over that ground?
No, I don't.
I can rant about that, Jimmy.
Nick Clegg is elected leader of the Liberal Democrats.
My election as leader today marks a new beginning. Choose something different.
Nick Clegg went from being Susan Boyle to Winston Churchill in a matter of hours.
This is the first coalition government for 65 years.
I think we had undoubtedly done the right thing for the country. It's a cutthroat place. You're only as good as the job you're doing on that day. It has been a cruel and punishing night. That's such a kind way of saying beaten. Defeated, crushed.
I just wondered if you've got plans for a new job after next week when you become unemployed and your party becomes an irrelevance.
Charming. I thought to myself, I'm not going to just sort of bugger off.
What is the job of President of Global Affairs at Meta?
Meta is an engineering company. Mark Zuckerberg is an engineer. One person's hate speech is another person's right to free expression. Take this down, take that down.
Are you still smoking?
What an absurd question.
What's it like working with Mark Zuckerberg?
Well, it's about 23.64%, and everyone sort of nodded.
And how do we encourage more ambition?
What did I sacrifice? I sacrificed sleep. It's not so much will technology affect jobs. Of course it will. It's the velocity with which it does it. I get as much vitriol from the Daily Mail as I would from the Guardian. I got it in stereo from both directions.
Nick, what is the job of President of Global Affairs at Meta?
I mean, the way I've heard Mark Zuckerberg explain it, so that's probably the best thing to ventriloquise on this, is that he sort of says the business is roughly, you can slice and dice it in different ways, but you can roughly sort of categorise it in three big chunks. The first bit, by far the most important, and the thing that he, is really most vested in, which is the product, is the engineering. These are highly complex systems. It might look simple to open the Instagram app. There's a lot of engineering and compute behind that. And so everything from our messaging apps, Messenger and WhatsApp, the social media apps, Facebook, Instagram, the kind of increasing sort of family of products around augmented and virtual reality, the headsets and so on, the cool-looking Ray-Ban glasses, and now, of course, increasingly, like all these big tech companies, the transformation into becoming a sort of AI-first company. So that's the engineering of the products. The second is it's principally, not exclusively, but principally and largely an advertising business. That's its business model. So there's the ads business model. And then the third bit is the bit which, in a sense, I preside over, which is all the difficult stuff. in the sense that it's all, it's about, I oversee all the policies of the company. And that is a very elastic term, but it means everything from very specific issues about what is the definition of hate speech through to what are the rules about candidates running political ads during elections and everything else in between, and all the interaction with legislators, governments, regulators and so on. And of course also the outward facing, how around the world, how the company sort of communicates itself. So and so I sort of lead that third chunk. My role has mutated a bit in the whatever it is 6.5 years I've been there, particularly after Sheryl Sandberg moved on. But that I think is a sort of good thumbnail description.
And that leads me well into my next question, actually, using the term thumbnail. What skills have you had to kind of upskill in yourself from politics to being in a sort of technology company?
Well, I mean, politics, as you know, is a sort of vocation where a lot of people take a very little smidgen of knowledge and string it out for most of their political careers. I mean, anyway, that's a slightly different debate. But politics in the end is about judgment and values and marrying sort of ideology with organisation and so on and so forth. Meta is an engineering company. Mark Zuckerberg is an engineer. And so I think the biggest thing I had to learn, in addition to the obvious, which is just learn about the technology, which is still an ongoing work in progress because the technology mutates so fast, and I'm not a technologist, I'm not a computer scientist, I've never written a line of code in my life and so on. So I really had to kind of, work hard, particularly in the early months, to just understand what I was dealing with, because I can't represent or engage in a sophisticated discussion without some understanding of the technology. That in a sense, and that's just hard work, but I think the more interesting thing was just a culture change, to go from a culture where I'd been for close to 20 years in politics, where so much of it is about the kind of idiosyncrasies and irrationalities and the sort of uneven timber of human behaviour. It's highly verbal. It's all about, I mean, particularly in the House of Commons, all about how do you give speeches and so on. Irrelevant to the rest of the world, but that's the way you're judged in the House of Commons and so on. To a place where you've got engineers who are just, they're building systems and they're building fixes and they think there's a lever here which they should pull and so on. And I think it took me a while to understand that I was only going to be able to do my job if I, as a sort of refugee from the world of politics and from European and British politics, which of course itself is a difference, to an American engineering firm, and I think I needed to learn how to sort of almost speak the language of my colleagues so I could get through to them. I remember in an early meeting, I'm probably somewhat misremembering this, but I hope it illustrates the point. I don't know what we were discussing, but something about would governments or regulators respond to X product with Y reaction, so on. And someone turned to me and said, So what's the percentage? What is your what is your assessment of the percentage likelihood that this is going to happen? And I laughed because I thought, what an absurd question! I can't put a, and then everyone looked deadly serious at me. So I then said, rather immaturely and facetiously, said, "Well, it's about 23.64%." Just almost trying to illustrate what I thought was a sort of, and everyone sort of nodded and said, "Well, and they said, and I'm being a little bit facetious. It shows my failing because what I've learned is this is it's a culture which is based on highly sophisticated engineering skills. Data is king. So if you want to make an argument, you have to show data. You have to, you have to prove your point. You can't just assert it. So I come from a world where politics is all about argument and assertion, to one where it's about proof and systems. And that's for me. It's been both an eye opener. It's I think been very good for me because I think I sort of learned how to try and make a case using an idiom, if you like, which was quite different to the one I was used to.
And do you find that what's more useful in your experience? Is it as Deputy Prime Minister or is it as a member of the European Parliament? Because like you said there, they're sort of two quite different worlds in themselves.
I think probably my experience of being in government for I was in government for half a decade with David Cameron. And I'm very proud of what we did in I think providing good government to the country over 5 years in a pretty difficult time. And I think the main skill you learn, amongst many others, you just have to take decisions. You can't keep everybody happy. You're always going to be put in an invidious position. You're often going to be faced with a whole bunch of choices, all of which are terrible.
Yeah.
Or at least at a minimum, all of which are going to piss somebody off. And I think one of the things I've been very struck by is, of course, if you are helping to run the world's largest social media platform used by whatever it is, 4 billion people or thereabouts every month, and dealing in the most controversial thing of all, which is human speech, when there's literally nothing more liquid, changeable and controversial, and also beautiful and wonderful as human speech. You just have to choose. You just have to make choices. You can't. And I think one of the things I believe, but you tell me, no doubt, have your own experience to draw and speak to other folk. But I think if you want to survive in government, one of the things you learn pretty quickly, you just have to choose. To govern is to choose. And I think that the capacity to choose and just line up what the choices are, and then not sort of blanch at the sort of invidiousness of it all and just say, right, we just got to choose, I think is something that I like to think I've brought to this job, is a certain sort of decisiveness and a certain just realism that, you take choices and they're going to have certain consequences. Some of them you can't predict and some of them are not even going to be easy. But that comes with, in the same way that to govern is to choose, to be as successful as Meta is also a question. Well, with great success comes great responsibility, but also the need to just choose. I mean, in a sense, the most familiar and oft-cited example is about speech. One person's hate speech is another person's right to free expression. Because remember, these platforms, and this is what I spend a lot of time on, are dealing with these push you pull me choices on content that is perfectly legal.
Yeah.
So no government or parliament has told us not. It's perfectly legal. So we're having to suddenly act, if you like, as almost as judge and jury on content, because the illegal stuff, it's obvious. I mean, the government said it's illegal. It's our job to try and identify and identify and remove it and so on as best as we can. It's just a classic example. You're just not going to keep. You're never going to keep. And in America, of course, in the United States, that debate itself has become a total zero-sum game, with roughly half the country thinking you're being censorious and removing too much of their content, and the other ones thinking you're not removing enough. And I think in that, I think I've probably brought a fairly unsentimental, gnarled view of an ex-Politico, which is like, you've got to just choose.
And what about the letter that Mark Zuckerberg wrote to Congress last week? I'd be interested in the kind of logic behind that, because you're probably the most senior policy individual now in the world, and the US election is the biggest event that's going to happen in policy terms. And that was quite a big intervention from Mark Zuckerberg, for context, saying that they'd been pressured in the past by the Biden administration to take down content during COVID, etc. Just what's the thought process behind that?
I mean, to be honest, to be rather specific, because it is important, that was a letter that Mark Zuckerberg wrote to a Congressman, Jim Jordan, who had led for quite many months. In fact, I'd given a deposition of my own to it, a sort of inquiry into the relationship between social media companies and the government. So I mean, it was released by the committee, so it wasn't something that Meta doesn't choose when these things are released. That was a congressional committee, and I mean, the letter speaks for itself, and I think almost all of it, has been actually rather well-worn ground. I of course I understand, in the very heated political environment in the United States at the moment, these things get crawled over perhaps more than might be the case in normal times. But for instance, the issue of the kind of back and forth between a company like Meta and not just the US government, but the British government at the time and others, and I was in the middle of all of that, and I, in a sense, was the point person taking all these calls and these demands when the world was panicking.
Yeah,
we forget this. No one knew how this was going to turn. No one knew whether there was going to be a vaccine. No one knew what this pandemic meant. So, not surprisingly, governments were going, take this down, take that down, and so. And I think sort of Mark was just saying, with hindsight, of course, as ever in life, with the benefit of hindsight, probably would have taken a different approach. So, I from my perspective, but of course I live and breathe this stuff. None of it was new. That's
but it just
context.
gets sort of dressed
up.
Of
course, understandably it does. But I think if you actually look at the sort of content, and Mark talked about the donation that he and his wife Priscilla had made to help election administrators who were in a real pickle in 2020. He entirely honourably thought that he and his wife thought they were just helping out with the kind of sinews of the electoral process. That then gets immediately accused of being a partisan intervention, which was not his intention at all. And he said before, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not minded to do that again. So I don't think there was anything new, but I understand why people would give it a sort of a fresh look in the very heated political environment we're currently operating in.
This episode is brought to you by World First, the exclusive official global payment solutions partner of Tottenham Hotspur. As a podcast that's constantly posting around social channels and even YouTube, we know all about the challenges of managing payments internationally. If you're running a business, whether it's paying staff, suppliers, or collecting and transferring earnings through marketplaces in different countries, it can get very frustrating and expensive. That's why World First is a bit of a lifesaver for SMEs. Their multi-currency account lets you handle all your payments in one place. And with the same-day transfers in over 90 countries, you don't have to worry about waiting days for your money. Plus, there's no monthly fees. And with the cheapest FX fees of 0.5% in the UK, they're a win for any business trying to stay efficient. And right now, for our UK listeners, there's a £200 sign-up bonus if you join today. So whether you're an online seller, podcaster, or handling payments across borders, head to worldfirst.com to make your life easier. World First, one account for global business. Now, let's get back to the show. That's fair enough. And in 2017, I wanted to go to the morning of Friday, June the 9th, where you were not elected as the MP for Sheffield.
That's such a kind way of saying beaten. Defeated, crushed.
I know, but I thought, gosh, why did you stand in the 2017 election? I mean, David Cameron and George Osborne previous year had sort of said,
I don't want to cast any aspersions on David or George. I just didn't. Everyone has to take their own decision. I kind of thought, hang on a minute. I had led my party for 8 years. I'd led my party for the first time ever in its history into government on the back, remember, of an election in 2010, where we got far more British voters voting for the Liberals than ever, before. I mean, I think almost twice as many as voted in the last election. But I think what the party in the meantime has worked out is how to make those votes work more efficiently in terms of seats. And then, of course, that then led to this catastrophic election in 2015. So I felt an incredibly strong sense of... I then, of course, resigned. I felt an incredibly strong sense of responsibility. I mean, really, lots of dear friends of mine had lost their seats. Lots of people had worked really hard through those pretty punishing coalition years. I think we had undoubtedly done the right thing for the country. We put country before party. But I thought to myself, I'm not going to just sort of bugger off at the first opportunity. That just didn't feel right. I thought, no, I can't say I enjoyed hanging around, ghost-like, if you like, in the backbenches of Parliament between 2015 and 17. But I did have quite a strong sense of sort of duty, which was, I'd led my party through thick and thin. By the way, it usually is that thick and then thin in politics. That's what generally happens to political careers. And I just kind of thought, no, I'm not going to abandon my post, to put it somewhat pompously. But then, of course, it was removed from me by a Labour candidate who turned out to be a crook. But anyway, that's a different story.
But you've had a big defeat in 2015.
Yeah.
You then lost the Brexit referendum in 2016, and then
I didn't lose.
You didn't lose.
I didn't
but
play
you
any role in that.
as a sort of
lunatic idea to have it in the first place. Anyway, do you really want to go over that ground?
No, I don't.
I can rant about that, Jimmy.
But then, so you're sort of in the Don Valley Sports Centre.
Yeah.
And I'm just fascinated in the journey from there to Silicon Valley, right? It's quite extraordinary. How did those sort of 18 months...
Well, aren't I lucky? Well, but by the way, since you mentioned it, I actually found, politics can be a very rough old business, and you shouldn't go into politics unless you've got, certainly if you want to do prominent things, unless you've got a fairly thick skin. And I certainly had a lot of criticism and vitriol and vituperation thrown at me in my time in government. No doubt some of it justified. I think some of it almost certainly not, certainly with perspective. But setting all of that aside, I actually found since you mentioned it, the night that Miriam and I remember had to walk into the Don Valley Centre for the count, was one of the ugliest atmospheres I'd ever seen in close to 20 years in politics. I mean, there was a sort of heaving, braying, almost sort of teetering on the kind of sort of violence sort of atmosphere of particularly of a lot of the then Labour activists at the time, who, obviously they scored this great victory. They got this great scalp. I was their number one enemy. I remember I think it was the trade unions. Someone had put a great big huge tarpaulin poster on the side of a wall in Sheffield saying Cleggzilla, with a picture of me treading on. I mean, it was very, very personal. But I remember thinking, wow, this is really ugly. So I always say, when people sort of say, polarisation. Politics, I mean, go back to the 70s, go back to the 60s. I mean, sorry, I'm digressing here, but I just think it's an interesting observation that people talk often about how the polarisation of politics is so much worse now. I certainly, in the 20 years I was in politics, saw a lot of pretty ugly polarisation. And I was reading the other day about people reminiscing about the 1968 Democrat convention in Chicago. I mean, people thought that America was coming to an end. Yeah. That was, by the way, well before social media was ever invented. Anyway, memories are short. No, I digress. From there, what did I do? Well, I had already, so after 2015, I had, even while still being an MP, I'd set up a little think tank called Open Reason, raised a bit of money for it, not a huge amount, employed 3 or 4 people. We had a nice little office in Somerset House. And I just did a few policy-oriented projects, particularly in 3 domains. One on Brexit, and I wrote a book called How to Stop Brexit. That went well, didn't it? A second one on, I'm a member of something called a Global Commission on Drugs Policy. It's a sort of gathering of some great and some good, looking at drugs policy reforms around the world. So I did some work on that. And the third was on something which I actually had encountered in my time in government, which is I saw in government that there was this growing backlash against technologies. It was a mixture of a political backlash, but also particularly from the Home Office. I had numerous somewhat fruitless discussions with your former boss, Theresa May, about this. And then, the securocrats in Whitehall, quite understand from their point of view, they're sceptical of any new communications technology which they can't control or surveil. And I saw that there was this growing backlash against technology, and I became, if I had any insight that I'll claim any credit for, is I think I saw quite early on that the backlash against technology could be as dangerous or as unproductive as the failings of the technology, or purported failings of the technology itself, because you end up sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I remember there was an early attempt, shortly after I came into government, of some people sort of buried away deep in the kind of security establishment saying we should basically somehow try and end encryption. Also, do you remember this huge argument? Theresa May, I vetoed what eventually became the so-called Snoopers Charter and so on. And so I early on, even as a Deputy Prime Minister, felt, now, wait, hang on a minute. The government's got to be quite careful that it doesn't try and sort of trample on the innovation and freedoms that these communication technologies. So I started talking about that, writing about that, and I think that is one of the ways that I somehow... I know. A dear friend of mine who'd been my predecessor, this shows how we join the dots by happenstance in life, who had been my predecessor, a guy called Richard Allen, wonderful dear friend of mine now, Lord Allen, who had been my predecessor as MP for Sheffield Hallam, had worked in Silicon Valley and latterly for Facebook. And he and I talked about this, and I think he then suggested to someone in as it was then Facebook, you might want to talk to Nick Clegg. He's very interested in this whole pendulum swing between the sort of, or actually not even pendulum swing, the sort of miscommunication between the tech world and the political world, and that then led to, well, eventually, Sheryl Sandberg picking up the phone and calling me. Much to my complete surprise, and then a whole bunch of conversations ensued.
And what would your advice be to lots of Tory MPs in particular at the moment, trying to figure out what's next, etc.? Like, what's your kind of advice on how to think about life after politics?
I can't give any advice. I've been so lucky. I think the only thing I think I would say is, and I have had a couple of ex-MPs and ex-cabinet ministers over the years asked, and I've given one piece of advice, which is just forget everything. Don't trade on past glories. Maybe there's some jobs where people care that you were the minister for pencil sharpeners in Department X or Y or Z, but in most parts of the private sector, they don't care for long. There's nothing more boring than politicians pontificating about their past sort of triumphs and disasters, and certainly in a place like Silicon Valley, this is a pretty unsentimental place. It's a cutthroat place. You're only as good as the job you're doing on that day. So, sure, I draw on my past. We all do. Our life is a series of chapters, sort of piled up on top of each other. But I think I've been pretty disciplined at just saying, right, it's just like I'm turning a page, I'm doing something else, and I'm only as good as what I do in this job. No one owes you a living because you once did an important job.
Yeah.
And I just think one of the hardest things for politicians, particularly I think from Westminster, which is an inordinately pompous place, I mean, the pomposity of it is just insufferable, is that people think that they can carry on in the rest of life just pontificating.
Yeah.
You can't. You've got to put in the hard yards. And you've got to put in the hard yards, and you've got to learn new tricks and new things and new skills, and just be unsentimental. Just let it go. Let the past go. It is difficult. I mean, I've been there. It's difficult because politics, as you know, I don't need to tell you, Jimmy. It's not a job. It's a vocation. It's a way of life. It courses through your veins. You never really let it go. I mean, in my heart of hearts, I will always think I'll be a politician of sorts. But you have to let it go if you want to build a proper career somewhere else. You can do sort of stuff that crosses over, obviously consultancy and lobbies, and so I'm not denigrating those at all. Then you kind of have to keep a foot in one world. But one of the things I was very clear about, and again, this is my choice. I'm not saying this works for everybody, but I was absolutely adamant that what I didn't want to do, because remember I was in my late 40s, early 50s at the time. I thought, wow, what am I going to do for the next 30 years? And of course, what a lot of people in my position would do is you end up in the House of Lords.
Yeah. Non-execs.
And then you sit on a few non-execs and you write a book that no one reads, and you pontificate occasionally on the graveyard slot of the Today programme when no one listens to you. You teach a course, And I thought, no, that's fine. But I thought, I just don't want to do that. I want to do something substantive still, while I still have the energy and the wherewithal to do so. So I was really, and anyway, I'd sort of try to abolish the House of Lords and replace it with an elected House of Lords. So it would be a slightly contradictory of me to then go there. So I just didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do that. And so partly because of my choices, partly because of my beliefs, I had to cut myself off perhaps more cleanly from my political life than I think than many of my colleagues and friends have. And again, that's a totally decent choice. It's just not the one I took.
And what have you learned about the economy of the future at Meta? And what do you think when it comes to the jobs of the future? I mean, when you look at the Meta page hiring in London, like, it's a huge amount of engineers. But I'd be fascinated in what you think the most transferable skills of the future are as well, because that's something that comes up a lot in your book, where you talk about that. That's part of the problem, rise of populism, etc., is that people feel lost in the economy, can't get the jobs, etc. So I just love your sort of thoughts on all that.
Well, I mean, I'm sure you've talked about this in lots of your episodes. I mean, clearly AI, or rather the latest version of AI, it's important, by the way. It's an important caveat that people keep talking about AI as if it's a new thing. It's been talked about since the 1950s.
Yeah.
And certainly in a company like the one I work at, it's been part of the fabric of everything that we do for years. There's nothing that you can see on Facebook and Instagram which hasn't in some way already been sliced and diced and ranked by machine learning and by systems. It's this new iteration of generative AI, this extraordinary sort of predictive ability, analysing and hoovering up vast amounts of information and data, and then kind of, if you like, guessing with sometimes unnerving accuracy and sometimes with sort of hallucinogenic error what the next sort of prompt and what the next word and token should be. That clearly is going to have quite a profound effect on society and economy. I think the jury's out about how quick that effect is going to be.
Yes.
How widespread and rapid the adoption is going to be. I think there's been a lot of breathless talk about that. I suspect it might be a little bit slower than people suspect. I think the technology is still much more flawed than people sometimes assume. I think we've wasted a lot of time, candidly. So not so much now, but certainly last year. And I think we wasted a huge amount of time going down blind alleys, assuming that this technology was going to eliminate humanity and that, we were all going to be zapped by a robot with glaring red eyes. It just became. I think it just became a sort of slight fiction of kind of headline writers' imagination. So I think we wasted a lot of time on the whole existential angst stuff. That may, but I mean we're so far from that at the moment. These are not systems which are able to, act with total self-deciding autonomy, and there's no indication that they're going to be able to do so anytime soon. But it's clearly going to be a very powerful technology, and clearly has the potential to transform public services boost productivity. Again, I personally, you read a lot of breathless predictions about it's going to eliminate, it's going to eliminate all desk jobs and, and silly stuff like Elon Musk saying there's going to be no work. So everyone's going to have to be sort of paid by the state to sit home and twiddle their thumbs. I doubt that very much. Technology has often had a very profound effect on the labour market. I mean, in the United States, I think now the people who work in agriculture is about 2% of the total workforce. It probably what was once almost close to 100%.
Yeah.
I read a study somewhere the other day saying that 60% of all jobs in the United States in 2018 did not exist in 1940.
Yeah.
So you get. I think the thing about the effect of technology on jobs is not so much will technology affect jobs. Of course it will, and often, by the way, it not only supplements but actually creates new jobs that you can't anticipate. It's the velocity with which it does it.
Yeah.
I think it's the speed that is the thing that you need to focus on from a societal point of view. And my hunch, but it's a hunch, is that actually the speed of adoption is going to be a little slower than and not least, by the way, some of the technologists in Silicon Valley assume. They kind of have this almost disarming assumption that because they've invented something, everyone's going to use it overnight. And of course, to be fair, there are some technologies, social media is a very good example of one, where the use was just explosive and the network effects were immense. I think Gen AI, which is already being used in workplaces, and interestingly, I read a report of a study by, I think it was Imperial and the Warwick Business School, showing that I think they were saying something extraordinary, like the places where Gen AI has already been deployed, I think they said 70 or 80% of those workplaces has led to more jobs being created rather than less. So do
you think more jobs will be created as a result?
I think it'll be both, won't it? It'll be both. It'll be both labour creating and labour displacing. It's super difficult to anticipate exactly what the net balance of all of those things are. In my view, the thing that government should clearly focus on is the capacity for people to constantly train and retrain. The thing that you're familiar with, the emphasis on lifelong learning, the ability for people to move from one career to another. And one of those clearly has to be an ease and a facility with using. It doesn't mean you need to be able to use, be able to write a line of code yourself. But I do think you need to understand how these systems can aid and abet and assist your work, from being a teacher in a classroom to being a logistics manager in a distribution firm to being an NHS manager. All of those different roles will right today already be able to use Gen AI in a pretty productive way to help them.
What should the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, be thinking about when it comes to AI now? So if you were back in a Western government.
Yeah.
Right?
So, and I don't want to sort of tread on your toes from what your previous experience, but I think this has been such a catastrophic period of time for the United Kingdom's reputation as a sort of sensible place to build a business and invest and so on, just because of what I regard as just sort of madness, really, since sort of 2000, since the Brexit election, and I think what we need to do is kind of reassert what we know are our qualities as a country. We speak English, wonderful. Mm-hmm. We have great universities, though we need to work out how to fund them, dare I say. It's a tricky subject that I've had my fingers burned on before, but this needs to be grappled. You can't duck it. In a knowledge-based, service-oriented economy, if you don't look after your crown jewels universities, you're screwed. And I really think... do
you think the American system is better when it comes to universities?
Oh, it's the layer of top-performing American universities now are literally in a league of their own. I think the gap between American and British universities has become... I mean, it's just widened dramatically, I think, in recent times. It's a lot to do with money. They have huge amount of resources, but it's also candidly because I think they have a much more developed culture of marrying intellectual and academic prowess with commercial and entrepreneurial success. You just get many more spin out. I mean, my oldest boy, just to give you an anecdotal example, has just graduated recently from an American university, from UPenn, and he's a clever boy. Gets it all from his mum. He did an undergraduate and graduate degree in physics. But listening to him and his mates at university, they're just they kind of, the read across between what they're doing and kind of the changes in the private sector. They're so much more alive to it, I think. Certainly the time when I was in university back in the 80s. But I think sort of generally there's that. And they just have this attitude that they don't treat undergraduates as like, you're in this silo, you're doing this one subject, of course, having done already this highly in my view, ludicrously over-specialised set of exams in A-levels, which is a terrible, I think, Achilles heel of our education system. It's way too specialised too early. And then that's all you're supposed to do. In the American system, you're encouraged to use right lobe and left lobe for much longer at university. You know, science, undergraduates can do arts and philosophy and whatever rest of it. So I think there's a versatility and an openness to kind of read across between academic pursuits and entrepreneurship and tech innovation, which is much greater. So I think that's the other thing we need to attend to in this country. But the other thing is we need to, and I think there are proselytizers like Tony Blair and others who I think they're basically onto the right thing, which is you kind of have a choice when it comes to a major new innovation like AI. Is do you embrace it and deploy it more rapidly than other jurisdictions? Or do you sit back, worry about the downsides, because there are always downsides, and just end up basically in the slow lane? I don't think the country has the luxury anymore. We're out of the European Union. We're unanchored from the world's, our own economic hinterland. We're somehow a little bit adrift between America and Europe. We have to be more nimble. I mean, we just have no other choice as a country. And that's why I think the stuff that Tony and others are advocating, I broadly agree with, which is one of the reasons, by the way, why, and I privately said this to them, whilst I totally understood why Rishi Sunak and Oliver Dowden were keen to host, as they did in the pouring rain, and I was there myself, this summit on AI safety and so on. It was a somewhat odd choice for the United Kingdom not to actually hold a summit championing AI innovation in public services, in health and education, or in the workplace. I think we have an opportunity to deploy AI in workplaces, in hospitals, in our transport system, in schools, safely and responsibly, of course, more rapidly than others. If we do that, because remember, you know this as well as I do, the great problem we have as a country, and we basically had it's basically been a sort of cross we've had to bear pretty well since the 2008 crash, is this productivity puzzle. Yeah. We've actually done quite well as a country, dare I say it, quite a lot because of the, I think, tough but correct actions that the coalition government took to boost employment. We recovered in terms of employment after that 2008 crash much more quickly than people think.
And what were the key reasons for that on employment and jobs?
Like, I'll come to that in a minute, but what and then earnings took a long time to recover, and then got damaged by Brexit just as they were recovering, which was a tragedy in itself. But the one thing we just haven't really been able to shift the dial on is on productivity. It is true that AI can really help a country like this as long as we move fast. Yeah, I cannot exaggerate how quickly this technology is evolving, and how if you go to parts of Asia and Southeast Asia, they're just embracing it so quickly with such alacrity.
But do you think there's an opportunity there on the safety stuff and on the regulation side that we can be trusted? We are going to be more nimble than the European Union. It's one of the arguments for leaving, etc. Like, don't you think that's an opportunity for the United Kingdom in terms of that safety aspect and that regulation side of things?
I've never personally understood the argument. I say this, by the way, as someone who was a legislator for close to 20 years of my life. I even worked in the European Commission for 5 years. I've never understood the argument, because you hear this in Brussels about being proud of the fact that you've passed a law before everybody else. What's the? I mean, it's fine, and it's an intellectual line. But it's like, what's the point of being a regulatory leader if you're not a leader in innovation and job creation and improved public services? Because these are the things that actually matter to society. It's not what is written on the vellum of the statute book. It's what actually, do our kids get a better education? Do our patients get a better and quicker diagnosis? Do our transport systems work more efficiently? Does our economy grow more quickly? Do we offer more jobs? I mean, we have a real problem in this country. You tell me whether I've got it wrong. My instinct is that we're just not producing white-collar, high-value jobs and the numbers that we should do and used to.
I agree with that.
We're actually doing relatively well on jobs which don't necessarily require higher education skills. We're not exactly sending our graduates to flip burgers, as they say in the United States, but we're perilously in danger of just not producing enough high-skilled, high-value jobs in this economy. And one of the best ways to try and do that is to embrace the deployment of this technology, not spend all of our time, which of course the press is always going to be pushing politicians to do, which is talking about the theoretical downside, and then spending all their time in Westminster passing new laws rather than actually getting these things into people's hands and deployed in the workplace.
I wanted to let you know that last week we launched Boxlight, a creative studio to tell the stories of British business. I believe that lots of companies are going to build their own media and content arms. We're taking all the lessons that we have learned from creating Jimmy's Jobs of the Future over the last 4 years and helping businesses create their own insightful content. Whether it's going to be attracting potential employees, drive sales, or even persuade government, I believe this will be the new form of communication. I think there's a growing appetite for long-form content. If you want to get in touch with the team to see how we can work with you, check out our website at boxlight.io. That's boxlight.io. Back to the show. And how do we encourage more ambition?
Well,
Right,
I think there is.
UK,
I think there is use cases, like hero use cases. I do think the work that Demis Hassabis and DeepMind and others have done in kind of showing how these systems can improve health outcomes and showing how that they not just that you can win a game of Go, but that you can actually improve those outcomes. And look, we've already seen, for instance, new antibiotics being developed for the first time in over 60 years because of innovations in AI. I think we need to constantly show those uses. It's that it helps our kids, it helps your health, it helps your taxpayer money go further, and so on and so forth. I think you need political leadership, which is why. You know this, I certainly remember this. You've only got so many hours of the day as a political leader, and you have to choose what you emphasise. If you spend all your time choosing to talk about the downside, you're not talking about the upside. You kind of just have to choose.
Yeah.
And that's why I hope the Labour government listens to people like Tony Blair and others. And then you have to stitch together, this is where all the hard work is, the smart people from universities, the big tech companies, including companies like Meta in offices like this, the entrepreneurs and developers who will be feeding off the foundation layer. Because remember, the AI technology, you've got the heavy lifting, which only a very, very small number of extremely well-resourced companies have got the resources. You need compute capacity and you need data in order to do this at vast, vast scale. But then on top of that, it's the developers who then actually create the value. That's personally why I feel this actually with some personal passion and why I've looked into it, but it's also something that Meta believes. That's why I think open sourcing of AI is so important, because you don't want these foundational models just to be controlled and kept in the clammy hands of a handful of very wealthy companies in Silicon Valley. So you need to work with the developers in particular, and of which there are a great number in the UK. Yeah. And if you can get this flywheel of developers, researchers and academics using particularly, but not exclusively, open source AI technology and then deploying it in public services and in ways that people see benefits them, I think you then start getting a virtuous cycle.
And is the biggest opportunity for government in that convening power, bringing all those people together? Because we're not as good at that in the States. That academia, business, government side of things is a much more, despite them being other ends of the country, is a much more kind of revolving door between them. It's not the case in the UK.
No, and it's partly because there's just so much. I get it. There's just so much suspicion of, big corporate entities, and as I said, it's just a fact that a lot of this generative AI technology is being pioneered by very large corporates. Yeah, because they're the only ones who've got the resources to actually build the underlying raw material, which is these foundation models, in the first place. But I just kind of think. I think we need to shift from where we were, in my view, at least about a year or so ago, which was a mixture of sort of doomerism, sort of hand-wringing concern about existential threat and deep suspicion of what the technologists were doing. And of course, you need to you need transparency, safety, the ability to test these systems, and so on and so forth. But you can flip that into one of partnership between the public sector and the private sector, between developers, academics, the big tech companies, and so on. I think that, in answer to your question, that is what the UK PLC should do more rapidly, as you say, than what they appear to be intent on doing in the European Union, more rapidly than what they can do in China, because in China, of course, everything is so much under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party, which actually will stymie a lot of the AI developments there. And in the US, interestingly, I agree with what you say about the flywheel, particularly between academia and the private sector. But it's, nothing seems to get decided in DC. I mean, the pitched battle between the Republicans and Democrats is so debilitating. We do actually have the capacity to take decisions in Westminster and Whitehall, perhaps more quickly than in DC at the moment. And look at the banking system in the United States. I mean, any Brit who goes to live in the US and is issued with a checkbook and given a telephone number of someone you actually have to ring to make a transfer will think, wow, this is stuck in the 1970s. There's no rule that says that just because you invent the technology, you're going to be any good at actually deploying it. I would argue that the retail banking system in the US is a dinosaur operation from a consumer point of view compared to what we have in this, or been used to in this. I couldn't believe it when I moved to Silicon Valley. I hadn't used a checkbook for years. So I do think there are opportunities there in terms of deployment of this technology, even against the kind of whiz-bang innovation that you see in the United States.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think that's a good sort of thing to finish on. We've just got a few sort of quick fires of I want to see how you've adapted to kind of.
I hate these. I always get myself in trouble with these. I reserve the right to just say neither.
Jaguar versus. Would you rather Jaguar or Tesla?
To drive?
Yeah.
Jaguar.
Favourite movie?
There was a fantastic Iraq movie by George Clooney. Was it called Three Kings or Four Kings? Three Kings. I love that.
Favourite biscuit? The one that really scares politicians?
Hobnobs.
Did you manage to get Oasis tickets?
Nope.
When we get the metaverse fully going and it's an immersive experience, when in history would you choose to go back to for 24 hours?
Oh, like in a...
Like to experience.
Yeah. Like I think in the kind of like that eruption of optimism in post-war periods.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe the 50s or maybe I was about to say the sort of swinging 20s and 30s. I don't know. I just think it would be so interesting to see what it must be like after the world has gone through
post-World War II
horror. That sense of rebuilding, and I think that must be quite exciting.
What fitness are you doing?
I swim.
You swim because you did kickboxing when you were in.
Yeah, I'm not doing that anymore. No, I swim quite regularly and play quite a bit of tennis.
Yeah.
Do a smattering in good middle class fashion of Pilates. Find that good for my middle-aged midriff.
Have you done any of the dieting, the fasting, 5-2 stuff? No, none of that. Are you still smoking?
No.
What do you think of the government banning smoking? As a liberal?
Instinctively, I'm going, wow. So, right, you've chosen as a consenting adult to sit outside somewhere. But the one thing I've learned about smoking is that, and which is important for politicians, is that societal opinion moves more than probably my liberal sensitivities and sensibilities would suggest. So, I find it quite a big step in terms of what the state is telling adults to do. But I'm also very struck that it's apparently really quite a popular thing amongst a lot of people. So
when you did Desert Island Discs, a packet of fags was going to be your luxury. What would it be now then?
Probably a packet of hobnobs.
And which is the meta app you use most?
Facebook. Actually, I use Facebook more than. Oh well, I use WhatsApp by far. By far the most. By far. But between Facebook and Instagram, I use Facebook more. A lot more.
And what would your advice be to young people thinking of going into politics?
Probably think of doing something else first. I think it becomes a real curse if you go into politics and you have nothing else you can fall back on. You cling to it too much, and that's that becomes a real weakness in politics. I think if you can do politics and know you can walk away from it, that'll put you in very good stead. So if you can, I always say to young people, it's great you care about politics. It's really important that smart young people go into politics, but you just mustn't make it your master, because it's such an unpredictable business. You can be the best, most gifted politician in the world and get nowhere. You can be the most rubbish politician in the world and get quite far. And no, but serious, it's not fair. I mean, it's not a meritocracy. It isn't. It ain't. It's quite different. So I just think having something you can fall back on and having an independent foot somewhere else in life is really important. Really important.
Who was your favourite Prime Minister?
Of all time?
Yeah.
Gladstone.
What's it like working with Mark Zuckerberg? What do you think keeps him driven 20 years on after founding the company at such a level? To maintain that level is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It is extraordinary. I've rarely met such a driven human being, and one who's able, which is, I think, part of the sort of secret of his maintains extraordinary curiosity and a sort of insatiable appetite to do two things: to learn.
Yeah.
So his ability to learn and listen for someone as successful and the rest of him and to compete. So he's got this he's an extraordinary competitor. I mean, anyone who's betted against him, I think, has generally sort of found that they've pulled the short straw. But I think it's the ability he's got to both be humble enough to learn, but sort of ferocious enough to always want to compete. Is quite an unusual combination.
How do you think, this is not a quick fire, but how do you think status symbols have changed?
Status symbols?
Yeah, I think it's something that's really interesting, that's changed over 30 years or so. And you also talk about it in the book, like really interestingly, like the problem as Deputy Prime Minister.
You mean my really interesting book called Politics Between the Extremes, which can still be bought from any decent bookstore?
It is, and it's good. I listened to the audiobook of it. But you talk about the sort of status symbols of power and how the Conservatives really got it.
Yes.
But actually, as Deputy Prime Minister, you had quite a lot of power, but compared to the American Vice President, you had none of the pomp and so on. And
I got it completely wrong.
Yeah, no, but it's
I got that wrong at least. Yeah.
But it's interesting listening back to it, and I just think it's one of the things that status symbols, the amount of followers you've got and all that, is something that's just come into our kind of lexicon in the last 10 years. It just didn't exist. So.
Yeah. Sorry, when you say status, I thought you meant do you have a fancy car or how big is your house?
I don't think that's important to people.
No, it might be, but I think in politics, which is certainly the context in which I wrote about it in that best-selling and outstanding book. In politics, never ever underestimate the phrase of "they look the part."
Yeah.
It's remarkable to me how powerful still the physical appearance of power is in politics. You wouldn't, I mean, I don't know, you cannot imagine how much thought I suspect would have gone into what Kamala Harris wore at the Democrat, Congress, that sort of authoritative dark blue, looking the part, and in the UK system, standing at the door of number 10, looking the part, standing behind the dispatch box and filling that space visually, I completely underestimated and misunderstood that it didn't matter how good I was at slaving away in the bowels of Whitehall, getting this policy right, winning that battle against, the Conservatives and the then coalition government, delivering this, manifesto commitment. If people didn't sort of couldn't visualise you literally at a glance, at a visual glance, if power can't be visualised quickly, and most especially by people who don't follow the minutiae of politics, then you're kind of invisible. And I totally misjudged that.
And as a final question, I'm struck by listening to Desert Island Discs and your book, etc., that when you were in government, you had 3 young boys. I have 3 young girls, all under 5, and I feel under quite a lot of stress and strain running a quite big podcast. He likes to think, how did you manage it? What advice would you give to young parents who are trying to juggle it all?
Honestly, I have no easy answer to that. I found it so tiring. So hard. I was constantly feeling guilty that I wasn't enough, at home. Miriam quite rightly carried on with her career. She was a partner at a law firm. She had a very busy time. She was not going to, just because I become Deputy Prime Minister, she was not going to give that up. Quite right too. So I felt super conscious that I didn't want to look back in my life and felt that I hadn't been part of my young children's life. So I was constantly going back. I mean, what did I sacrifice? I sacrificed sleep.
Yeah.
And that in itself, I think, again, is something which I think anyone in government will tell you. Anyone in government will tell you that one of the great problems in government is the country is governed by people who are chronically underslept, and that was certainly the case in my for me. I think. Look, I think with hindsight, I probably would have said to my younger self, "Look, relax. Your kids will be fine.
Yeah.
Don't stress out about it too much." But I'm very pleased with hindsight that I did work as hard as I did to continue to play such an active role, or at least as much as I could in my kids. I've got, of course, they are the most important people in my life, and I'm just delighted that we didn't, as a family, get as bashed about as a family by politics as I think you can be. And I think it might be a change now. The newspapers, I think, are way less important in political life now than they used to be, and probably a lot less than they think they are. But in my time, if you got hounded as I was, and I'm not saying this out of any self-pity, but if you get absolutely clobbered by the press, in my case, it was, I would get as much vitriol from the Daily Mail as I would from the Guardian. I got it in stereo from both directions, so they were either both right or both wrong. But anyway, it does. I think it can. What people always forget is it's not you, because in a sense, why should anyone? No one should give a damn what a politician thinks. They've put their neck on the block, if you like. But it's the families who get hurt. The families get very hurt, I think. And I was super, super conscious that I wanted to protect the kids, but also Miriam from a lot of that. And one final thing I'd say on this is, I think it's much, much harder to be prominent, and particularly if you're prominent and controversial, as clearly I was. Of course, it was going to be controversial. I was leading a smaller party for the first time ever into a coalition government. I think it's much harder if you have teenage kids. I think teenage kids are more vulnerable to hearing and seeing what is said about mum and dad than smaller kids. And so, oddly enough, I actually think with hindsight, whilst I strained every sinew and didn't sleep, I'm actually relieved my kids were small, because I wouldn't have wanted teenage kids to see the stuff that was being said about me at the time.
That's interesting. I'm always grateful that my years of dad being in opposition were 10. I was 10 to 22. So, so like,
and he was in opposition.
Yeah, so it wasn't my fault.
Yeah. But just imagine if you'd been a 16-year-old, and you wouldn't have liked that, would you?
No,
because teenage years are very vulnerable years.
Yeah,
very vulnerable years.
And you have a great line in the book about we've got to be careful that we don't end up with a politics full of monks, nuns, and robots.
Well, no, but this is, then we should know that end. But I mean, it is a very serious point. It's like if we want normal people in politics, which we should, and I'm really encouraged, by the way, from what little I've seen of many of the new MPs in the Lib Dems and Labour. There's lots of really smart people with different hinterlands and so on. But if you want normal people, you can't have this guy. You can't have this guy. You just mash up. Not mashing them up's one thing, but you mash up their family and their kids as well. Why should anyone put themselves through that?
Completely. Well, let's finish on that. Senator Clegg, thank you very much
for coming
on Jimmy's Jobs.